possessing the most expansive territorial footprint on the globe, no longer serves as an impenetrable shield against the encroaching realities of modern warfare, because the historically unshakable doctrines of aerial combat are being mercilessly shredded by compact, autonomous machines that wield a truly apocalyptic, destructive power. The most staggering and theatrical manifestation of this paradigm shift unfolded on a fateful night, when the colossal geographical expanse of the Russian Federation transformed from its greatest asset into a fatal vulnerability, completely collapsing Vladimir Putin's defense architecture and sending shockwaves through international aviation circles. The genesis of this unprecedented disaster can be traced back to Moscow's desperate bid to shield its most irreplaceable and exotic aerial assets, specifically the heavily hyped Su-57 and the workhorse Su-34 fighter jets, from the creeping inferno of the front lines by banishing them a staggering 1,700 kilometers deep into the hinterlands. This panicked, makeshift exodus behind the formidable Ural mountains was not born out of thin air. It was the inevitable climax of a relentless, escalating pressure campaign orchestrated by Ukrainian forces that had spent the preceding months systematically piercing the veil of Russian territorial security. Previous audacious strikes against the Su-57s resting at the Akhtubinsk testing grounds in the Astrakhan region had already triggered deafening alarm bells within the darkest, most paranoid corridors of the Kremlin. Terrified by this glaring vulnerability, the Russian High Command haphazardly greenlit a radical and chaotic evacuation protocol to preserve what little remained of their multi-billion-dollar aviation crown jewels. The most vital squadrons stationed at Western airfields, which had suddenly morphed into outright death traps under the shadow of billions in shattered infrastructure at Engels and Akhtubinsk, were swiftly disassembled and spirited away in the dead of night. Their new, supposedly untouchable sanctuary was the Shagol military airbase, nestled within the freezing, unforgiving climate of the Chelyabinsk Oblast in the southern Urals, practically kissing the Asian border. This astronomically expensive and labyrinthine logistical nightmare was executed through a clandestine symphony of nocturnal military freight trains, heavily camouflaged transport convoys, and direct transfer flights operating under a suffocating cloak of radio silence, all driven by the desperate hope of distancing these irreplaceable fleets from the lengthening reach of Ukrainian ballistic missiles and the ever-evolving menace of stealth kamikaze drones. However, an unfathomable and catastrophic truth remained completely ignored by Russian military intelligence, whether out of sheer technological incompetence or an agonizing terror of delivering bad news to an increasingly erratic upper echelon. From the very inception of this so-called top-secret relocation, Ukrainian intelligence had an absolute, omniscient view of the entire operation, tracking every single tail number and pinpointing the exact apron coordinates where the landing gear touched down. The notion of secretly maneuvering such a massive, radar-heavy fleet of Su-57s across the transparent, digitized battlefield of the 21st century was nothing short of a delusional fantasy. Ukrainian cyber warfare divisions had silently infiltrated and decoded the anomalous scheduling on the Russian railway networks weeks before the first engine ignited, flawlessly synthesizing real-time satellite telemetry with hyper-encrypted ground reports from a sprawling network of deep-cover partisans. That distant, freezing Shagol base, the supposed ultimate fortress for the Su-57s and the heavy-bombing Su-34s, had already been painted with a giant, invisible bullseye by the Ukrainian General Staff before the evacuated pilots even unbuckled their harnesses. Armed with the precise inventory of the relocated fleet, Ukraine pressed the historic button that would violently alter the trajectory of the conflict during the dead of night on May 5, 2026. The Ukrainian Unmanned Systems Forces unleashed a flawless, merciless barrage against the Shagol facility, a base that Moscow smugly assumed to be utterly immune to danger, given its 1,700-kilometer buffer from the combat zone. Under the cover of pitch-black darkness, the deepest, most secluded coordinates of this Asian-bordering military sanctuary were violently awakened. For this monumental endeavor, the Ukrainian armed forces deployed a swarming armada of long-range, one-way suicide drones, meticulously engineered from the ground up by their own brilliant aeronautical minds. Descendants of the fearsome Lyuty platform, alongside classified, state-of-the-art autonomous variants, served as the brazen, silent executioners of this unparalleled sky raid. Hauling devastating explosive payloads of approximately 100 kilograms, these were not repurposed commercial toys or cheap knockoffs. They were hyper-intelligent purveyors of destruction, outfitted with bleeding-edge, artificial intelligence-driven terrain mapping optics that guaranteed lethal precision even when satellite links were completely severed. The supposedly impenetrable multi-billion ruble domes of electronic warfare and GPS jamming that the Russian military incessantly bragged about proved utterly useless against these machines, which autonomously locked onto their prey with cold, mechanical, absolute certainty. Capitalizing on unprecedented fuel efficiency, the phantom-like Ukrainian drones lurked in the freezing Russian airspace for well over 10 hours, skimming just above the tree line to evade radar detection in an operation masterminded by the world's first official drone army and the legendary Magyar's Birds Brigade. Entering their final terminal phase, the robotic swarm abruptly climbed before executing a breathtaking, deadly dive directly into the billion-dollar targets lined up defenselessly on the Shagol aprons. The apocalyptic scene that the rising sun illuminated the next morning was the absolute realization of the Kremlin's darkest strategic nightmares. By May 10, 2026, the Ukrainian General Staff proudly and officially broadcasted the catastrophic outcome of this deep strike masterclass to a stunned global audience. Unmanned Systems Forces Commander Robert Brovdy took to the airwaves, ruthlessly and mockingly dismantling the desperate Russian attempts to conceal the smoldering wreckage beneath giant tarpaulins, confirming that exactly 4 critically essential Russian fighter jets parked on those supposedly invincible Ural aprons had sustained direct, catastrophic hits. The devastation was so profound that panicked, high-level aviation engineers and special inspectors were urgently scrambled from Moscow to assess the mangled metal, while leaked high-resolution satellite imagery mercilessly laid bare the colossal humiliation that the Kremlin desperately attempted to bury. The heavily scorched aircraft had been frantically dragged by tractors to obscure corners of the tarmac in a pathetic bid to evade the relentless gaze of Ukrainian orbital surveillance. The true magnitude of what the Russian aerospace forces lost in this audacious, 1,700-kilometer deep strike is almost impossible to quantify, as the strategic worth of these devastated machines extended far beyond their mere combat utility. These jets were the very lifeblood of the Russian defense industry's prestige, with the Su-57 Felon standing as the absolute zenith of their aeronautical engineering, representing billions of dollars and decades of grueling research and development, intended to serve as the ultimate, 5th-generation stealth counterweight to American aerial hegemony. These flying supercomputers command an eye-watering price tag ranging from $100 to $120 million per unit, equipped with Mach 2 capabilities, advanced NO-36 Bielka AESA radar systems, and DIRCM laser defenses. They were heavily marketed as the undisputed, invincible kings of the sky to lucrative foreign clients in India and the Middle East, designed to stealthily assassinate targets from vast distances using internal R-37M missiles. Conversely, the mangled Su-34 fullbacks represented the brutally pragmatic, unglamorous backbone of Russia's war machine, serving as $50 million flying fortresses capable of lugging 8 tons of heavy munitions. These aerodynamic leviathans, operated by a side-by-side crew, were the exact instruments of terror that had been mercilessly pummeling Ukrainian defensive lines with massive 3-ton glide bombs, single-handedly disrupting the tactical balance of the front. Yet, the production lines for the Su-57 were practically paralyzed from their inception, choked by crushing Western microchip embargoes and severe technological blockades that left the total number of operational airframes, including archaic testing prototypes, languishing pitifully around the 30 to 42 mark by mid-2026. These stealth fighters were so astronomically expensive, and their sanctioned electronic guts so impossible to replace, that the Russian brass never possessed the courage to deploy them into heavily contested airspace, terrified of losing them to Patriot missile batteries and strictly confining them to cowardly, long-distance standoff strikes. Meanwhile, the Su-34 fleet had been bleeding out constantly since the invasion's dawn, decimated by Ukraine's increasingly sophisticated AI-augmented air defense networks. Verified intelligence confirmed that at least 41 of the original 140-strong invasion fleet had already been incinerated, leaving the remaining pilots to fly with the perpetual, crippling dread of imminent death. This is precisely why the Shagol inferno transcended a mere tactical skirmish over twisted metal. It was a blaring, irreversible manifesto that the Kremlin's cowardly doctrine of hiding its most prized assets in the deep rear had spectacularly failed. The highest echelons of Russian leadership were forced to swallow the bitter pill that they could no longer protect their most exorbitant, irreplaceable military investments from the infinitely expanding, lethal reach of Ukrainian ingenuity. The deeply ingrained myth of the untouchable Russian hinterland, a foundational pillar of their military strategy and public propaganda, was reduced to ashes in a single night amidst the terrifying hum of incoming drone rotors. Ukraine's astonishing technological leap, fueled entirely by domestic engineering brilliance, engineered an asymmetric power imbalance that completely bypassed the trenches, transforming the endless, freezing expanse of European Russia into an unprotected, free-fire hunting ground. The massive strategic Tu-95 and Tu-160 nuclear bombers, hibernating at the Engels base, the top-secret testing facilities in Alenia on the Kola Peninsula, and the operational hubs in Mozdok were all violently thrust into a state of perpetual, agonizing paranoia. The vital logistical arteries of the war machine, pulsating through Voronezh, Rostov, and Kursk, now operate under the constant, terrifying shadow of an AI-driven reckoning descending silently from the heavens. This unprecedented vulnerability extends far beyond military aviation, exposing the colossal, mountain-carved ammunition reserves near Yekaterinburg and the sprawling, war-funding Siberian fuel refineries to the merciless crosshairs of Ukrainian precision strikes. Western military analysts universally acknowledge that this explosive surge in asymmetric capability, churned out at breakneck speeds from subterranean Ukrainian factories, is irreversibly hijacking the ultimate destiny of the conflict. By deploying highly intelligent, swarm-capable drones that cost a fraction of a fighter jet's landing gear, Ukraine is methodically bleeding dry a gargantuan Russian air armada that required decades and hundreds of millions of dollars to assemble. While Moscow pathetically attempts to maintain primitive, grinding pressure on the immediate front lines through archaic human wave assaults and blunt artillery, the sophisticated logistical nervous system that sustains their war effort has been completely structurally paralyzed. This catastrophic degradation is not merely a battlefield inconvenience. It represents an insurmountable economic and reputational hemorrhage for a nation already suffocating under the weight of unprecedented global sanctions. The devastating glide bomb operations, Russia's last remaining trump card for breaching Ukrainian defenses, are grinding to a halt amidst mounting aircraft casualties and insurmountable maintenance nightmares, exiling their surviving aviation remnants even further into the desolate, unequipped wastelands of Siberia, permanently neuters their operational tempo to near zero. While the alternative, stripping the multi-billion-dollar S-400 defense umbrellas from the capital to protect these remote outposts, would leave the front entirely exposed to Ukrainian skies. The suffocating psychological dread inflicted upon the Russian populace, the political elite, and the exhausted soldiery is a terrifying abyss that defies all mathematical quantification. The terrifying realization that absolutely no city, base, or sanctuary within the motherland remains secure is now permanently seared into the national consciousness. In the realm of international diplomacy, Ukraine has forcefully cemented its status as an indomitable, sovereign powerhouse, capable of entirely bypassing Western hesitation and embargoes to organically manufacture the technology required to paralyze a nuclear-armed leviathan inside its own borders. Striking the absolute beating heart of the Russian military apparatus from 1,700 kilometers away, with entirely indigenous weaponry, has fortified Kyiv's negotiating posture in a profoundly unique and irreversible manner. As we navigate through May 2026, the globe's first and only dedicated unmanned systems army is violently, brilliantly and relentlessly tearing the scepter of aerial dominance from the trembling hands of archaic, billion-dollar fighter jets. The critical equilibrium of aerial power is shifting into Ukraine's favor, with a terrifying momentum that the Kremlin's obsolete strategists could never have anticipated, and for which they remain utterly powerless to counteract, proving that the Ural Mountains, once the mythical, impassable shield of the Russian Empire, have been terrifyingly transformed into a colossal, frozen graveyard, where Putin's delusions of invincibility burn brightly in the dark, immortalizing the absolute desperation of a crumbling regime. So what are your thoughts on this dramatic shift in the theater of war? We eagerly await your insights in the comments.